They told me to act dead at my son's wedding, a phrase so cruel and sharp it carved a hollow inside me that no time could fill. I remember his voice, low and urgent over the phone, the exact words slipping out like a secret poison. "Mom, it's easier if the guests think you're gone." I was stunned, unable to process what I was hearing, as if my own son had erased my existence. With a simple instruction. Those words haunted me long before the wedding day arrived, settling in my bones like a cold shadow that I could not shake off. I'm 82 years old now, living in a small apartment above a florist shop in a quiet neighborhood that smells of fresh blooms and rain-soaked pavement. The apartment is modest, cluttered with memories and keepsakes that remind me of the life I once lived and the woman I used to be before I became a ghost in my own family story. I sit here, often by the window, watching passers-by and wondering if they know the weight I carry, the wounds invisible to the naked eye, the silence I was forced to wear like a shroud. My son, Marcus, is a man who has built his life carefully, brick by brick, crafting an image that required my disappearance for the illusion to hold. I sometimes think about the boy he once was, the little boy who clung to my hand when the world felt too big and frightening, the one who laughed at my clumsy attempts to dance in the kitchen, and I mourn for what we lost along the way. The invitation to his wedding never came. Instead, I received a vague message suggesting I take a quiet vacation during the ceremony, as if my presence would be a disruption, a stain on their perfect day. The pain of being told to stay away from my own son's most important moment is hard to put into words because it is not just rejection, but an erasure of a lifetime of love and sacrifice. I have lived long enough to know that family can be both a source of strength and a well of betrayal, and I found myself cast into the latter, left to wander in the cold corridors of absence. I remember the day I found out about the false story being told to the guests, the whispered version of my life that declared me dead years ago. The photos on the wedding website, the slideshow tribute, the empty chair set aside in memory of me, these were the cruel fabrications that replaced the reality of my presence. I was supposed to be a memory, a myth, a quiet casualty sacrificed at the altar of social convenience. This betrayal struck not only at my heart, but at the core of my identity, making me question what it means to be a mother when your child wishes you had never existed. Despite the shock, I resolved not to disappear quietly. The world may have wanted me to vanish, but I had one last act to perform, a final declaration that I was still here, still breathing, still claiming my place in this life. In the days leading up to the wedding, I quietly arranged for a rented casket to be delivered to the reception venue, a symbol of the lie they wanted to tell. Inside that casket, I placed a carefully written speech, words that spoke truth to the silence that had surrounded me for too long. On the day of the wedding, while guests mingled and whispered about the tragic loss, I lay inside that casket, preparing to rise and reclaim my story. The moment I opened the lid and stood before the stunned crowd was one of profound power and vulnerability, a reclaiming of the voice that had been silenced by rejection. My speech was not a tirade of anger, but a measured account of the pain of being erased, of the loneliness of being forgotten by the people who should have loved me most. I told them how it felt to be reduced to a ghost, how it is worse to be alive and invisible than to be dead and remembered. The room fell into a hush as I spoke, faces pale and mouths agape, caught between shock and shame. My son's expression was unreadable, a mixture of disbelief and regret, while his bride clutched her glass as if it might shield her from the truth. After I finished, I closed the casket lid behind me and walked away from the spectacle, knowing that I had taken back the narrative of my own life. Since that day, I have lived with the quiet satisfaction of having made my presence known in the most unforgettable way. And though Marcus has not reached out, and the world around me continues to turn as if nothing happened, I carry a peace born from reclaiming my dignity. I volunteer at a literacy center, wear colors that brighten the gray days, and keep the dress I wore that day carefully folded in my closet. The Casket rental company sent me a thank you note saying my story was one they would never forget, and I keep that note as a reminder that even when others try to bury you, you can rise again. This is my story, one of invisibility and return, of betrayal and triumph. And if it finds you when you feel unseen, remember that sometimes the loudest voices come from inside a closed lid. You are not gone until you choose to be. 2 weeks before Marcus's wedding, the call came on a cold gray morning when the sky was heavy with unshed rain, and the world outside seemed to hold its breath. I was in the kitchen preparing my usual breakfast of oatmeal and black tea when my phone rang. His name flashed on the screen, and a flutter of hope warmed my chest despite the lingering ache I carried from years of quiet estrangement. When I answered, his voice was clipped, strained with a kind of distance I hadn't heard before. "Mom," he said quickly, almost breathlessly, "I need to talk to you about the wedding." I smiled, imagining he might finally invite me to be part of this moment I had waited so long to share. But instead, he told me to stay away, to not come at all. "It's complicated," he said, the word hanging in the air between us like a barrier. "Brooke doesn't want to explain the family situation. It's better if people just think you aren't here anymore." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I blinked, as if willing the words to disappear, hoping it was some cruel joke, but his voice remained steady, resolute. "We told everyone you died years ago. It makes things easier." My heart lurched, a sharp stab that left me breathless. I tried to understand, to find some reason behind the cruelty, but there was none. The person I had raised, the boy who once clung to my hand when the thunderstorms scared him, had chosen this lie over the truth of me. I asked why, how this could be, but his answers were vague and rehearsed. He spoke of appearances, of maintaining a certain image for his bride's family, of the wedding as a delicate dance where I was no longer welcome. He offered to pay for a trip somewhere quiet during the ceremony weekend, a vacation designed to keep me out of sight and out of mind. I refused, my voice trembling with the sting of rejection. I told him I was coming, that nothing could erase the years of love and sacrifice that made me his mother. Our conversation ended with a cold, "We'll see," and a click that echoed in the empty kitchen long after the line went dead. In the days that followed, the betrayal unfolded in subtle, cruel ways. The wedding website appeared online, and there it was. My name replaced with the word "late," a photo of a young woman smiling brightly, cropped and softened as if to erase the lines of age and pain I bore. The slideshow at the rehearsal dinner included a tribute to Marcus's mother, but it was a carefully curated memory, a ghostly presence woven into the backdrop of their story. Old friends and distant relatives called me, their voices thick with confusion and pity. I lied, saying I was just keeping to myself, shielding them from the harsh truth. The pain of invisibility settled over me like a shroud. I was there in the same town, yet erased from the narrative of the day that should have been mine to share. The echoes of laughter and music from the wedding venue felt like a distant world, one I was no longer part of. The people I had raised, fed, and nurtured had constructed a reality in which I was dead. It was a silence louder than any argument, a refusal to acknowledge my existence. My attempts to reach out to Marcus were met with cold indifference or outright avoidance. The invitations I received were perfunctory and distant, thinly veiled attempts to placate rather than include. Each message was a reminder that the bond we once shared was now severed by a lie, a deliberate choice to erase me from their lives. This rejection was not born of a single moment, but of years of subtle neglect and growing distance, the slow unraveling of a relationship that had once been my anchor. I remembered the small cruelties, the way he avoided my calls, the excuses for missed birthdays, the silences that stretched between us like chasms impossible to cross. The wedding was the final act, the culmination of a long and painful exclusion, and yet amid the betrayal I felt a spark of defiance. I realized that if they wanted me to be dead to them, I would show them that I was alive, and no lie could bury the truth of who I was. I began to plan quietly, reaching out to old friends and distant cousins who still remembered me, finding ways to reclaim my voice. The rented casket, the speech I wrote, the quiet rebellion that would take place inside that hollow box were all part of a final declaration that I refused to be invisible. The catalyst was not just the phone call or the lie told to the wedding guests. It was the moment I understood that my son had made a choice to erase his mother, and that I had to respond not with anger, but with strength. It was the moment when betrayal turned into a breaking point, when the silence forced upon me became a loud and clear statement of survival. I was no longer a ghost to be mourned. I was a woman reclaiming her place in a world that tried to forget her. The day of the wedding arrived, but I was not there to be a silent shadow. I was ready to emerge from the casket and speak my truth, to remind them all that death is not the absence of life, and that even when others choose to pretend, I am still here, still breathing, still demanding to be seen. After the cruel conversation with Marcus and the bitter realization that I was to be erased from his wedding, I found myself caught in a strange limbo, where my presence was neither welcomed nor fully denied, but carefully ignored. The world I had once inhabited, the family I had nurtured and supported for decades, seemed to have folded in on itself, leaving behind a void filled with silence and absence. The days leading up to the wedding were marked by a creeping invisibility that deepened with each passing hour, a slow but relentless erosion of my identity within the very people who bore my name. I watched from the shadows as invitations were sent, guest lists finalized, and the narrative of the day carefully curated to exclude me, to recast me as a memory rather than a living woman. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting or scenes. Instead, the erasure unfolded quietly, like a dimming light, almost imperceptible until the room was plunged into darkness. The wedding website was a particular wound. It bore a page dedicated to Marcus's mother, but the words were carefully chosen to suggest that she was a figure from the past, someone who belonged to a storybook rather than the reality of the day. The photographs were carefully filtered, the smiles softened, the years compressed into an image of youth that bore no resemblance to the woman I had become. Friends and distant relatives sent messages asking cautiously about me, as if afraid to disturb the delicate lie that had been woven around my absence. I answered in vague terms, saying I was keeping to myself and not feeling up to socializing. It was easier to lie than to face the shame of being cast out, to explain that my own son had wished me dead in the eyes of his new family. The silence from Marcus was the most painful. His refusal to speak, to acknowledge my pain, or even to answer my calls, was a slow, deliberate cutting of ties that left me bleeding in solitude. I was not just excluded from a wedding. I was excluded from his life, from the memories he created, from the future he built. The subtle cruelty of his actions was magnified by the way he framed the narrative to others. To them, I was a tragic figure, a woman who had faded away, whose absence was mourned but unquestioned. They pitied me without knowing the truth, that this absence was not by fate or circumstance, but by choice. I became a ghost walking among the living, visible only in whispers and sideways glances, a cautionary tale of family fractured by silence. As the days ticked down, the emotional weight grew heavier. I found myself withdrawing not out of shame, but as a defense against the pain of rejection. I stopped reaching out, stopped asking for explanations or apologies that would never come. Instead, I turned inward, wrestling with the storm of emotions that threatened to engulf me. Anger, sadness, confusion, and a deep, aching loneliness all mingled within me, a tempest that no amount of tears could quell. Yet, amid the darkness, a quiet resilience began to grow. I remembered the years of love and sacrifice, the nights spent comforting scraped knees and broken hearts, the meals prepared and lessons taught, the endless acts of care that had defined my role as mother and grandmother. I realized that their attempt to erase me was not a reflection of my worth, but of their fear and selfishness. The more they tried to silence me, the louder my own voice became in the chambers of my heart. In the days before the wedding, I took small acts of rebellion, subtle assertions of my presence in a world that sought to forget me. I returned to old friends who still remembered me, found comfort in the company of those who saw me not as a ghost, but as a woman with a story to tell. I began to write again, filling pages with memories and feelings I had long suppressed. The act of putting pen to paper was a lifeline, a way to reclaim my narrative and prepare for the confrontation that was to come. One afternoon, I visited a small, quiet chapel near my apartment, a place where I had once taken my children to pray and find peace. Sitting in a pew, I allowed myself to grieve for the loss of the family I had known and the rejection I had endured. The silence of the chapel was a balm to my wounded soul, a place where I could gather strength for the battle ahead. I made arrangements to rent a casket, a symbolic vessel for the lie Marcus wanted the world to believe. It was not a morbid act, but a deliberate statement. If they wanted me to be dead to them, I would give them a performance they would never forget. Inside that casket, I placed a speech I had written, a testament to the pain of erasure and the courage it takes to reclaim one's life. I practiced it quietly, over and over, until the words felt like a shield I could carry into the storm. The day of the wedding arrived, and with it, a mix of emotions I had not anticipated. There was fear, yes, fear of humiliation, of confrontation, of the unknown. But there was also a fierce determination, a refusal to be invisible any longer. When I lay inside that casket, waiting for the moment to emerge, I felt the weight of years pressing down on me, but also the lightness of reclaiming my truth. The act was not just for them, but for me, a declaration that no one, not even my own son, could dictate my worth or silence my voice. This first escalation, the slow and quiet erasure followed by my deliberate planning and preparation, marked the turning point in my journey. It was the moment when I stopped waiting for permission and started taking back control. The subtle cruelty of exclusion was met with the quiet power of resistance. And though the road ahead would be difficult, I was no longer a passive victim, but an active participant in my own story. The moment when I decided to take control of my story was not sudden, but it marked a profound shift in the way I saw myself and my place in the world. For so long, I had allowed the silence imposed upon me to shape my identity, to make me small and invisible. Yet, as the wedding day approached, I felt a stirring inside, a flicker of something I thought had long been extinguished, a fierce and unyielding resolve. I knew that if I was going to be treated like a ghost, I might as well haunt them properly. In the days before the ceremony, I reached out quietly to a cousin who still maintained connections with people in Marcus's circle, someone who could help me arrange the one thing that would speak louder than words, a rented casket. It was not an act of despair, but a carefully calculated symbol, a vessel that would carry not my death, but my voice back into the room where I had been so deliberately erased. The casket was delivered discreetly, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the wedding venue, where it would soon take its place as a silent testament to the lie being told. Inside that hollow box, I placed the speech I had written, words crafted from years of pain, love, and resilience. I practiced reading it in the quiet hours of the night, the pages folded carefully inside the lining of the dress I planned to wear. A dress Marcus remembered from my high school days, a reminder of a time when I was not invisible, but central to his life. This act of preparation was transformative. It gave me a purpose beyond the pain, a mission to reclaim my narrative and demand recognition not through anger or desperation, but through a quiet, undeniable truth. On the morning of the wedding, I dressed carefully, choosing the dress and accessories with intention. The fabric brushed against my skin, comforting and familiar, as if it held the strength of the woman I once was and the one I was becoming. Arriving at the venue, I was guided to a back room where the casket would be placed, a small corner set aside for a memorial tribute to Marcus's mother. The irony was not lost on me. The lie they told required a ritual, a moment of mourning for someone who was very much alive. As I settled into the casket, the silence around me deepened. I could hear the distant murmur of guests, the clinking of glasses, the soft strains of music that underscored the day's celebration. Inside the wooden box, I felt a strange mixture of confinement and liberation. The lid was heavy, but it was also a shield, protecting me as I gathered my strength. I thought of the years of quiet endurance, the moments of being seen and unseen, loved and neglected. The casket became a symbol not of death, but of my refusal to be silenced any longer. When the time came to open the lid, I emerged slowly, deliberately, allowing the shock to ripple through the room. The guests froze, their smiles faltering, their conversations dying on their lips. Marcus's face turned pale, his carefully constructed facade cracking under the weight of truth. Brooke clutched her champagne flute as if it might protect her from the disruption I represented. I began to read my speech, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. I spoke of silence, of erasure, of the pain of being written out of one's own story. I told them how it felt to be reduced to a ghost, to be mourned for in absence rather than loved in presence. The words were not a condemnation, but a call for recognition, a plea to see the woman behind the myth. The room remained still, the silence deepening into something profound. I folded the speech carefully, stood up with grace, and walked out, leaving the casket lid to close behind me like a full stop at the end of a sentence long overdue. This moment was more than a confrontation. It was a reclaiming of self. The shift from silence to voice, from invisibility to presence, marked a turning point in my journey. I realized that while I could not change the past, I could control how I lived the future. The strength I found in that act of defiance carried me forward, giving me the courage to rebuild my life on my own terms, free from the shadows cast by those who sought to diminish me. After the wedding day had passed, the silence that followed was deafening, yet not peaceful. The act of emerging from the casket and speaking my truth did not bring the immediate closure or reconciliation I had hoped for. Instead, it opened a new chapter marked by a different kind of struggle, one that tested the boundaries of my strength, my patience, and my resolve. The days that followed were filled with unexpected confrontations, both subtle and overt, as the family and the world around me reacted to the statement I had made. At first, there was shock, a wide and palpable gap of disbelief that slowly morphed into a series of calculated attempts to regain control over the narrative. Marcus, who had frozen in that moment of revelation, now distanced himself even further. His silence became more deliberate, his avoidance a quiet rebuke that spoke louder than words. I learned that Brooke, the woman he had chosen to marry, was working behind the scenes to contain the fallout, carefully managing conversations with friends and relatives to minimize the disruption I represented. The family's response was orchestrated with a chilling precision, a mix of damage control and subtle intimidation designed to pressure me into retreating. Letters arrived, formal and cold, from lawyers who claimed to act on Marcus's behalf. They spoke of concerns for my well-being, of offers to help me transition into a more appropriate living situation. The tone was patronizing, veiled threats wrapped in the guise of care. These letters were not pleas for understanding, but instruments of control, reminders that despite my act of defiance, I was still expected to conform to their idea of who I should be. Quiet, compliant, and invisible. I responded with measured calm, refusing to be bullied or coerced. Each letter was met with a carefully written reply, asserting my rights, my autonomy, and my decision to live life on my own terms. The legal threats only strengthened my resolve. I knew that the battle was no longer just about family, but about reclaiming my dignity and independence. Beyond the formal confrontations, there were the social repercussions that cut just as deeply. Invitations that had once been routine stopped arriving. Friends I had known for decades grew distant, caught in the uncomfortable position of choosing sides or retreating into silence. The neighborhood I had called home for years began to feel alien, a place where whispers followed me like shadows. The erasure I had faced within my family extended outward, a ripple of exclusion that threatened to engulf my entire world. Yet amid this second wave of exclusion, a different light emerged. Unexpectedly, my grandson Kieran reached out. Unlike his father, Kieran was gentle, unguarded, and sincere. His letters arrived like lifelines, fragile threads connecting me to the family I had lost but still loved. He wrote of confusion and sadness, of longing and hope. His words were free of blame or judgment. They simply expressed a desire to understand and to be understood. Kieran's presence became a balm to my wounded spirit, a reminder that not all bridges were burned, and that love, in its purest form, could survive even the deepest fractures. We began to exchange letters more frequently, each one a small step toward healing, a quiet rebellion against the silence that had tried to define us. At the same time, Brooke made an unexpected appearance at the cafe where I had begun to rebuild my life. Her visit was tentative, marked by awkwardness and unspoken tension. She spoke softly, her eyes avoiding mine as she attempted to explain the family's decisions. "We panicked," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The flight was boarding. The kids were restless. We thought you were behind us." Her words were a fragile confession, but they carried the weight of guilt and regret. I listened without interruption, not to forgive or condone, but to acknowledge the complexity of the situation. The encounter was a turning point, revealing the layers of fear, control, and misunderstanding that had shaped our fractured relationships. Meanwhile, the local news picked up on the story of my disappearance and dramatic return, publishing articles that painted me as a missing matriarch and family enigma. These public portrayals, though tinged with sympathy, also reduced me to a spectacle, a character in a story I had lived but could no longer control. The media attention brought new visitors, questions, and unwanted scrutiny. Yet it also forced the family to confront the consequences of their actions on a wider stage. I received messages from strangers who had experienced similar betrayals, offering solidarity and shared strength. Their stories became part of my healing, a reminder that I was not alone in my fight for recognition and respect. The crescendo of this second escalation came with a letter from Marcus himself, filled with anger, accusations, and veiled demands. He accused me of causing distress during what was meant to be a joyful occasion, of turning a family celebration into a battleground. There was no mention of the pain I endured, no acknowledgement of the years of silence and neglect that had led to this rupture. Instead, his words sought to paint me as the antagonist, the source of discord. I read the letter carefully, folding it with a calm I did not fully feel. This was the final push, the last attempt to shame and control me, but I was no longer the woman who would bend under the weight of their expectations. I responded not with anger, but with clarity. I refused to be manipulated into silence again. The boundaries I set were firm and clear. I would live by my own terms, free from their control, free from the chains of past pain. This was not revenge, but liberation. Alongside the familial turmoil, new relationships blossomed that grounded me and gave me hope. Arthur, a kind widower I met at the cafe, became a steady presence in my life. His quiet companionship and gentle humor reminded me that connection could be simple and healing. Joyce, my landlord and friend, offered a home not just in shelter, but in acceptance and understanding. Together, they formed a new kind of family, one built on respect and mutual support rather than obligation or control. This second escalation was a crucible, a testing ground where the old wounds were reopened, but also where new strengths were forged. It was a period of confrontation and reflection, of facing the past and choosing how to move forward. The pressures and attempts to silence me became the catalyst for deeper self-discovery and empowerment. I learned that survival was not about avoiding conflict, but about standing firm in one's truth, about reclaiming agency in a world that often seeks to diminish the voices of women like me. As I look back on this chapter, I see not just the pain of exclusion, but the courage it took to resist, to speak, and to live authentically despite the cost. The journey was far from over, but I had crossed a threshold. I was no longer a passive figure in a story written by others. I was the author of my own narrative, writing with the ink of resilience and the courage of survival. The culmination of my journey was not marked by fireworks or grand proclamations, but by a quiet, deliberate act that sealed the transformation I had fought so long to claim. The day I chose to send the letters, each one carrying a weight far heavier than any spoken word, was the moment I finally drew the line between the past that had bound me and the future I was determined to build. One letter was addressed to Marcus's lawyer, a crisp, clear statement that left no room for misinterpretation or manipulation. It declared my autonomy, my sound mind, and my unyielding refusal to be coerced or controlled under the guise of concern. I sent it with steady hands, knowing that it would close a chapter of legal posturing and veiled threats that had sought to intimidate me into submission. The words on the page were precise, devoid of bitterness yet unshakably firm. No further contact would be tolerated unless it respected my boundaries and dignity. The other letter was shorter but no less significant, sent directly to Lisa, Marcus's wife. In it, I did not plead for understanding or demand apologies. Instead, I offered a calm acknowledgement of what had transpired and a clear declaration of my decision to no longer participate in a relationship marked by erasure and pain. I know what you did. I know what you didn't say. I'm not angry. I'm not coming back. Take care of your own life now. The letter read. These lines were not a surrender, but a release. An act of letting go that carried with it the weight of years of hurt and the lightness of newfound freedom. Sending those letters was both terrifying and liberating. I knew that the silence that would follow might be deafening, that the absence of response could be a final, harsh rejection. Yet I embraced the unknown, the empty spaces between words and replies, as the fertile ground where my healing could take root. In the days that followed, the world shifted in subtle yet profound ways. Marcus did not call. Lisa did not reply. The lawyer's letters ceased. It was as if I had stepped off a precipice into a void, but instead of falling, I found myself suspended, held aloft by the strength I had summoned from deep within. This absence of contact was not loneliness, but a clearing. A space where I could breathe without the weight of expectation or judgment. I began to see my life as something new, unbound from the roles and scripts others had written for me. I embraced the simplicity of my daily routines, the comforting rituals of morning coffee and quiet walks, the gentle companionship of friends who valued me for who I was rather than what I had been. The cafe where I worked became more than a job. It was a sanctuary, a place where my presence was not questioned or hidden, but welcomed and appreciated. Heather, the manager, offered me shifts without hesitation, her quiet support a balm to my soul. Arthur, the widower who had become my friend, shared stories and laughter over cups of tea, reminding me that connection could be gentle and sustaining. The new apron Heather gave me, deep green with embroidered letters declaring, "Not your grandma's kitchen," was a symbol of this fresh chapter, a testament to my refusal to be defined by the past. The emotional climax of my journey, however, was not found in external markers, but in a simple private moment of reflection. One evening, as the sky deepened into dusk and the world outside quieted, I sat on the porch with Joyce, my steadfast friend and companion. Wrapped in blankets against the evening chill, we watched the moon rise slow and steady over the rooftops. In that shared silence, I felt the full weight of all I had endured and all I had reclaimed. Joyce, ever the pragmatist, broke the quiet with a knowing smile. "You know they're going to show up, right?" she said softly. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle within me. They would come, with their questions, their demands, their attempts to pull me back into the roles I had shed. But I was ready to face whatever came with the same calm resolve that had carried me through the darkest days. The next morning, I wrote a letter, not for the family, not for the lawyer, but for Kieran, my grandson, and the one thread of hope that had never frayed. This letter was filled with tenderness and honesty, a bridge offered without conditions. I told him I was safe, that I had built a new life on my own terms, and that while I was not angry, I was done waiting to be seen on their terms. I invited him to visit alone when he was ready. Sending that letter was an act of faith, a recognition that love could survive even in fractured families, that connection could be rebuilt on the foundation of respect and choice rather than obligation. When Kieran arrived weeks later at the modest motel where I had found shelter and new beginnings, the reunion was quiet and unassuming, but profoundly healing. We did not cry or speak of the past in heavy words. Instead, we shared moments of simple companionship, talking about books, life, and the possibility of a future where love was not bound by the mistakes of those who came before. In that embrace, I found the culmination not only of my journey, but of a new beginning, one that carried the promise of peace and the courage to continue living fully and authentically. The climax of my story was not a loud victory or a dramatic reconciliation, but a quiet reclaiming of self, a refusal to be silenced, a declaration of independence, and the gentle opening of a door to hope. It was in these moments of stillness and clarity that I understood what it truly meant to rise from the ashes of betrayal and find freedom in the act of choosing myself again and again. In the quiet aftermath of all that had passed, I found myself settling into a new kind of peace, one that had nothing to do with forgiveness or forgetting, but everything to do with acceptance and the gentle reclamation of my own life. The days no longer carried the sharp edge of expectation or the sting of rejection. Instead, they unfolded with a steady rhythm that I had chosen for myself. I woke each morning not to the weight of what was lost, but to the possibility of what could still be. The letters I had sent, the final cuts that severed old ties, had opened a space not just for absence, but for renewal. I did not hear from Marcus again, nor did Lisa reach out beyond a brief, awkward message that I chose not to answer. Their silence was both a relief and a sorrow, a clear signal that the path I had taken was one I would walk alone. But I was no longer afraid of solitude. It had become my companion, teaching me the strength that comes from standing on one's own. The friendship with Arthur deepened, his quiet presence a steady anchor in the shifting tides of my new world. We shared simple pleasures, a cup of tea, a walk through the neighborhood, the soft music of afternoon birdsong, and in these moments, I rediscovered the joy of being seen and valued for who I truly was. Joyce remained a steadfast friend, her gruff kindness a balm for the bruises I carried. Together, we created a little sanctuary in her modest home, a place where I was not a shadow or a ghost, but a woman with stories, laughter, and dreams still unfolding. One day, as autumn brushed the trees with gold and crimson, Kieran came to visit again. This time, there was no hesitation between us, no unspoken fears or guarded words. He arrived with a book of poems he had collected, the pages marked with notes and underlined lines that spoke of hope and resilience. We spent the afternoon reading aloud, sharing stories not just of the past, but of the futures we imagined. In his presence, I felt the threads of family weaving slowly back together, not as they once were, but in a new pattern shaped by respect and understanding. I knew that our connection was fragile and would need nurturing, but it was real, and that was enough. At night, when the house was quiet and the world outside softened into darkness, I often sat at my desk, writing letters not to be sent, but to hold the thoughts and feelings I was still sorting through. One letter, folded carefully and tucked behind my old recipe cards, was addressed to myself, a reminder and a promise. "Dear me," it began, "you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them, they let go, and you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done." These words were not self-congratulation, but a quiet acknowledgement of the journey I had traveled, the grief, the courage, the relentless hope that carried me forward. The community around me grew slowly, new friendships blossomed, and I found myself involved in small acts of kindness and service that grounded me and gave purpose to each day. I baked for potlucks, volunteered at the local library, and shared my stories with women who, like me, had faced invisibility and rejection, but were finding their own paths to healing. Each step was a testament to the resilience that lives in the quiet corners of our hearts, the strength that rises not in grand gestures, but in the steady claim of our right to exist fully and freely. Looking back, I see now that I was never truly abandoned. I was released from the roles that no longer served me, from the expectations that sought to silence my voice. I did not rebuild my life. I built something new, something unshakable and true. If my story reaches you, if it finds you at a moment when the weight of being unseen feels too heavy, know this: you are not alone, and it is never too late to choose yourself. You are your own sign, your own noise in the silence. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here. And if my words moved you, share them. Let someone know that freedom begins with the courage to step away. From the airport lounges, from the shadows, from the quiet places where we are told to hide, step into the light that is always waiting for you, waiting to see you as you are, alive, whole, and unbreakable. I did not plan for a second act, yet life kept setting small stages in ordinary rooms and asking me very politely to step forward and speak. And perhaps that is the only kind of spotlight an old woman can still trust, the kind that arrives without applause and leaves without a bow. A month after the letters, the florist downstairs asked if I would help her deliver arrangements to the community college on a rainy Thursday. And because the day felt like wet wool and I needed a purpose, I agreed, and in the lobby I saw a bulletin, board with curling flyers and a fresh white sheet pinned in the center that read, "Listening Project, Oral Histories of Women Over 70. Tell us." What they erased. And I stood there so long, the florist tapped my shoulder and whispered that the roses were thirsty and the lilies gossip, and I laughed and wrote my name on the sign-up sheet with the slow confidence of someone who has finally learned that offering your story is not begging, but a form of authorship. When the student assigned to me, a serious girl with chipped navy polish and a recorder no bigger than a matchbox, asked for a quiet place, I led her not to a seminar room but to the window bench by the vending machines where a humming coil made the air warm and faintly sweet, and I told her everything I could without harming what was already healing, which meant I spoke plainly about erasure and less plainly about grief, that I described rooms rather than accusations, and let her ask about the casket only when she was ready, and when she finally whispered, almost apologetically, whether I had been afraid inside the box, I said that fear is a room with poor lighting and too many mirrors, and that the lid closing felt less like a door and more like a curtain, and I realized as I spoke that I had begun to use theater as a translation for my life, because it allowed metaphors to hold some of the weight my bones no longer wished to carry. The girl sent me a transcript a week later with my commas intact, and my pauses marked with small brackets that made silence look like something crafted rather than spilled. And in the margin she wrote, "You sounded like a lighthouse," which is ridiculous and lovely and not entirely wrong, since I have learned that illumination is simply steadiness that survives weather. Word traveled the way it always does, passing through hands that arrange centerpieces and hands that stamp forms at City Hall, until a parish priest called the cafe one morning and asked for the woman with the green apron who once gave a speech from a casket, and I told Heather to tell him she had just stepped into the walk-in to argue with the butter. But curiosity tugged, and I met him at a corner booth where the vinyl had split and been mended with clear tape that caught the light like an honest scar. He was younger than the title suggests and older than the stubble on his chin admitted. A man who handled his coffee as if it contained something fragile, and he apologized before he had articulated for what. His sentences circling around the word, oversight until it blistered into admission, and only then did I realize he had officiated the wedding and had allowed the memorial table to stand with my photograph and years of absence printed under it like credentials. And he said he had gone. Along with the family's request, because pastoral neutrality is a habit that can calcify into cowardice. And he wanted to tell me that his silence had not been ignorance, but a failure of nerve. I listened, because listening is a form of dignity, and when he finished, I told him that complicity does not soften with explanations, but it can be thinned by courage, and that if he truly wanted to atone, he could change the questions he asks when families stage the dead, and perhaps consider that the holiest act at any altar is refusing to let a lie borrow incense. And he nodded as if I had laid a hand on his fever. And before he left, he slipped a folded card across the table, not with money, thank God, but with a poem copied in an unsteady hand about mercy arriving late and still being mercy. And I kept it in my wallet behind the crisp emergency 20 I never spend, because I like to imagine a version of myself who could still run after a bus. Meanwhile, Arthur learned to walk with his cane as if it were a quiet conversation rather than a defeat, and he began keeping a notebook of birds seen on our afternoon circuits, sparrows that looked like punctuation against the telegraph wires, and one brazen jay that scolded a child for dropping a cookie and then ate the cookie with theatrical reluctance. And sometimes we sat on the library steps and traded stories like postcards. His about an Arizona monsoon that once pushed rain sideways into his sleeves, mine about the evening my mother sewed a hem while standing so the fabric could remember her spine. And on those steps, I told him about the fund I planned to start at the library, just $50 a month scraped from tips and thrift. And a bracelet I sold without regret, a small envelope labeled Visible Women that would pay late fees for grandmothers who told bedtime stories out of borrowed books and forgot to return them because life is a basin that never stops filling. And he kissed 2 fingers and tapped the notebook as if blessing the birds for lending us their verbs. Joyce pretended to scoff and then brought out a shoebox of coins she had been feeding from her laundry room jar since the price of eggs started misbehaving, and we counted it on the kitchen table while Franklin the cat arranged himself upon the exact paper we needed next, and I took the first envelope to the head librarian, a woman with ice cream hair and a jaw that had said no. So often it now did so at rest. And when I pushed the money toward her, she stared like I had slid her a confession, then cleared her throat and asked what name to put on the plaque. And I told her plaques are for walls that wish to be museums, not rooms that wish to be read. And we settled on a small line near the checkout computer that said, "Late is not immoral," category, which made 3 teenagers laugh out loud and one father folded into a lesson that looked suspiciously like compassion. If there was an unpredictable turn, it arrived as a practical request that understood theater better than the wedding ever did. The community center hosted a series called Living Funerals, a strange and tender experiment where people who feared vanishing practiced saying goodbye while still breathing. And the organizer, a woman whose clipboard had weathered more seasons than my coat, asked if I would facilitate the first circle because she had heard I could speak from inside a box without sounding buried. I told her I would do it if we used an open pine coffin with no hardware, and a rug underneath that didn't pretend to be anything grander than clean, and she agreed. And on a Saturday that smelled of floor wax and shy courage we gathered, 6 strangers and me, and I watched them rehearse the sentences they had always wanted to hear addressed to their names, not the eulogies that make a life sound airbrushed, but small sentences that felt like broth. You made soup for me the winter my heat broke. You laughed at my joke before I finished it. You showed up with a hammer and stayed until the shelf stopped sighing, and when it was my turn, they would have let me pass, generosity being a currency the frightened spend too quickly. But I said no and climbed in barefoot because shoes make too many formal promises, and I described the sensation of closing one world to enter another of my own making, how the grain under my palms felt like an old hymn, how I learned to leave a little space between my back and the bottom so breath had room to choose not to argue with wood. And when I sat up again, I saw a man crying into both hands, like someone finally taught him how. And afterward, he pressed a note into my palm that simply read, "Thank you for making an exit look like a doorway and not a verdict." Kieran began calling on Sundays, not dutifully, but with the ambling warmth of someone who has found a bench he likes and keeps returning to it. And we developed rituals that felt like stitching rather than stitches, comparing the worst metaphors we had read that week, trading photographs of unremarkable skies because the unremarkable ones ask less of you. And once he sent me a picture of his shoes beside a small mossed stone that said "Mother in a Cemetery" he had wandered into by chance. And I answered with my own picture of a park bench I had adopted without paperwork, and we decided that benches are simply horizontal tombstones for the living, which is not morbid if you accept that rest is a holy practice. He came in person with a box of unsorted snapshots rescued from a garage shelf, and we spread them on Joyce's table like tarot, letting the images tell us what future they were willing to promise. And he asked if he could take the graduation photo, where my hair was trying to be a halo and failing, and I said yes, because failure is an honest stylist. And he slid the picture into his wallet without trimming the edges, which made it curl slightly like a living thing. He never pressed me for reconciliation with his father. He understood that bridges are not owed, they are engineered, and sometimes the river below has decided to be a lake. There were still tremors, of course, the phone calls that hung up when I said hello, the letter with a return address made only of numbers and a sentence that pretended to be reasonable, the rumor that I had joined a cult of performance grief, which made me laugh hard enough that Arthur worried and rubbed my back exactly 3 circles longer than necessary. And now when trouble knocks, it arrives like a traveling salesman with the wrong briefcase. And I listen politely and then remind it that my thresholds are rented to boundaries now. On a windy afternoon, I went to the DMV to renew the photograph that had been punishing me for 7 years, and I wore my navy coat and my mouth the way it is when I have just tasted a line of poetry I intend to memorize. And the young man behind, camera asked if I wanted to retake because I wasn't smiling, and I told him women my age have been smiling for receipts since the invention of ink, and I would prefer to look like someone capable of telling the truth about the weather. And he shrugged and clicked. And when the license arrived in the mail, I recognized myself with the relief you feel when a mirror finally stops interrogating you. I took that license to a small office above a bakery and had the clerk add a middle name that had lived in my head for decades, a name my mother once considered and didn't choose because money chooses for you, and now my cards read like a sentence, with a verb in the center, and every time a pharmacist calls it out, I think, there she is, the woman who put a hinge in her own name. One evening, the florist knocked and asked if I would carry a bouquet to a house 3 streets over, because her knee had staged a protest. And when the door opened, I stood facing the bride's mother from the wedding, a woman whose pearls had spoken, more than her lips. And for a second, we both measured the distance between past and present, like tailors checking a hem. And then she stepped aside and said nothing sharp, only that the dining room needed flowers because a guest of honor had become a ghost midweek, and I saw the folded paper place cards already turned into little white tents none of the guests would occupy. And I set the bouquet down and wished the room patience, not peace, because peace is too ambitious for the freshly wounded. And at the threshold, the woman asked if I knew the best way to remove wax from linen, and I told her to let it harden and scrape. Never blot while warm, or you will press the stain into the thread. And she nodded as if I had given her something larger than laundry. And I walked home past 3 porch lights that blinked a pattern only moths can read. I dreamed that night of a doorbell that rang, and when I opened it, there was only a pair of shoes pointing outward. And in the morning, I decided to buy my burial plot, while I am still mobile enough to choose shade. And at the cemetery office, I asked for a corner with poor grass and a view of nothing spectacular, and the director, a woman with earrings like commas, warned me that people regret not choosing trees. And I told her I intend to haunt benches, not branches, and we compromised on a spot where families will pass to reach those they miss, and I can overhear names and lend them a little courage as they walk by. And I asked if I could install a small wooden seat with the inscription "I was here," which is either the simplest boast or the bare minimum of a life. And she said the rules allowed memorial furniture if it stayed under 3 feet and did not try to be a throne. And I signed the paperwork with the calm I reserve for soup. The living funerals continued monthly, and one afternoon a thin woman with weathered hands arrived carrying a shoebox and asked if the box could ride inside the coffin with her. And I said everything that belongs to your story belongs to this room. And inside she had kept 60 folded napkins she had embroidered over the years with the names of guests who had eaten at her table and left too early. And as she lay down, she spread them across her chest like small flags from countries that no longer exist. And when she sat up, she said she had realized halfway through that she did not want a funeral at all, but a long, impolite dinner where nobody checked a watch. And we laughed, and afterward she pressed 1 napkin into my hand, my name, stitched in thread the color of late tomatoes, and it was the first time in months my eyes flooded without tasting of old salt. They tasted instead like rain that has finally found the drain it deserves. On my way home, I stopped at the library to slip a few dollars into the envelope and found that someone, perhaps a teenager with a Sharpie faith, had added a second line beneath our first. Returning is a kind of love. And I stood there in the hum of the copier and thought about how many of us leave and return and leave again and are, in that rhythm, still very much alive. And then I went upstairs to the genealogy corner and looked up nothing in particular, just practiced being the ancestor of my own future. If my son ever reads any of this, it will be because he wandered into a room he did not expect and sat down too tired to stand, and a sentence caught his ankle and asked him not for remorse, but for attention. And I am not crafting that moment. I am not saving him a chair, but I am also not locking the door, because my life now is built on thresholds that do not apologize for existing. And on certain mornings when the light hits the front steps of the cafe at a friendly angle, I pause with the Keys and think how astonishing it is that a heart can become a house with so many doors, and how relief sounds like a bell that will never entirely stop ringing. I still keep the dress I wore that day folded on the shelf, soft with forgiveness I choose not to spend all at once. And sometimes I run my hand over the seam where I once tucked the speech, and I hear again the collective intake of breath from a room that had believed a lie until a hinge announced otherwise, and I understand that the bravest sound I ever made was not the speech itself, but the rustle of fabric when I stood, the sound of an old woman rearranging a narrative with her body. I'm not a moral, I'm not a warning, I'm not even a lesson clean enough for textbooks. I am a person who kept living, and if you need a map, take this. When someone asks you to vanish, choose a verb they cannot conjugate for you and use it daily, until your mouth remembers it without effort, and when the time comes to lie down, on a bench, on a bed, in a box, make sure the lid you close is only on what no longer serves you, and leave the rest ajar for air, and for sparrows, and for the chance that someone will sit nearby and say your name the way a match says yes to flame.